Today I'm here with Geoff Shullenberger. Geoff is the founder of the Outsider Theory blog, as well as a senior lecturer at NYU's Expository writing program. Geoff, welcome to the Agora Politics podcast.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you on. I'm really excited to get into some of the things that I think we're going to talk about today. So right off the bat, I want you to tell me about this Outsider Theory project that you're doing in your spare time. What it means to you, and what you think is going on with it.
Sure. So it really it became a way for me to bring together a couple of areas of interest that I maybe previously understood as separate areas of curiosity. Mm-hmm. But that it turns out that outsider theory is sort of a useful term for all of them. And so they may still be somewhat separate, but at the same time, they all kind of belong under that heading. So the first one is conspiracy theory, basically, as it's usually called. So it's, sort of unauthorized intellectual activity that often gets put under that heading. And, the sort of quality of that, not unlike the quality of sort of legitimate academic theory, varies considerably. But, there is a good amount of production in there that is at least highly fascinating and deserves careful attention and interest. Mm-hmm. And, conspiracy theory is a term that was really devised as a way of kind of dismissing or being able to disqualify a lot of that sort of thought. And, that's not to say that, clearly some of what gets put under that heading probably should be, but I still want to have a more curious attitude towards that kind of stuff. And maybe we can get into why I think that later on. But sure. So that's one element. Another element is I've been very interested in how basically this body of writing and thinking that's often called theory or French theory, which is essentially the kind of structuralist to post-structuralist sort of efflorescence of kind of radical and quite original and unique thinking that came out of France in the 60s and 70s particularly, and then was gradually kind of, if you read Francois Cousset's book, French Theory, it's kind of about how that was not really a unified thing until it came to the United States and kind of became understood as that, right? In its original context, it was not really understood as all being part of the same thing. But what I'm interested in is how that kind of body of work is sort of transmitted into other realms, and particularly non-academic realms, and how it kind of mutates and evolves when it sort of escapes the confines of the academy in particular. Mm-hmm. So basically, so you can sort of see how those two are potentially convergent because, in some cases, I think there is a kind of paranoid element of a lot of that kind of theory. And so there's a kind of interesting way that it can converge with the conspiratorial under the heading of a kind of popularized hermeneutic of suspicion. Mm-hmm. And then the third element really comes out of one of the French theorists I've been most engaged with, who's René Girard, and his theory of the scapegoat, as this figure who is the outsider and who in some way helps constitute a community by standing outside of it and sort of being expelled or marginalized by it, but in that sense becomes the kind of linchpin by which its unity is achieved. So those are really the three kind of facets of the project, and they all kind of overlap and interact with each other. But that's basically the sort of somewhat eclectic but thematically unified project.
Okay, so those are great, and I'd love to get into each of those points. But for right now, I guess one of the higher level questions that I have for you, just personally, is obviously there's this sort of, I guess, general theory of the outside, right? Marginalized ideas, marginalized figures, people who are a little bit too close to the edge in their thinking, or even dangerous, you might say, in various ways, or dangerous ideas as in conspiracy theories, etc. But you yourself are someone who's decidedly on the inside in your capacity as a lecturer at NYU. So how do you view your, I guess, decision to pursue that endeavor? And do you think that it actually is something that's outside the confines of normal academic life?
That's a good question. So standard, professional ambitions of the academic. My position at NYU is such that I'm teaching my my sort of evaluation and promotion. I mean, I'm on multi-year contracts and I am full-time, but is not based on what I write. It's really based on my teaching and sort of service to the university. And so as a result of that, I have a certain amount of freedom because I'm not expected to publish any particular kind of thing. Like there's sort of a value placed on just being active as a writer, as an intellectual, but I'm not really evaluated on that. And in a sense, the university doesn't really care what exactly I write, or who I write it for, or anything like that. So that's a certain amount of freedom I have through that relative marginality, which, the cost of which is like I'm not getting paid as well. I don't have the same level of job security, although I'm better off than the average adjunct. But it does afford a certain amount of freedom to not really care about academic professionalization and to, just do things that are a bit weirder and maybe wouldn't be all that valued, but that, in a sense, allow me to pursue things that are more interesting to me. And to be honest, have a much wider readership than I did. I mean, I have a much wider readership for my blog than I ever did for any of the sort of peer-reviewed articles that I wrote. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's, the value you get out of engaging in the academic publication game is a kind of is one where you're essentially accumulating sort of markers of prestige, but you're not, the sort of communities, or I wouldn't even call them that, the sort of subgroups and specializations are so siloed that, just very few people read anything that you write for those kind of publications. And, you can go to the conferences and things like that, but to me, it's a lot more interesting to just write weird stuff that like all sorts of weirdos on the internet find, and that, they get me into conversations with like people who have nothing in common with me professionally or, in terms of my training, but who do share certain of these interests. Like that's a great deal more interesting to me and sort of intellectually stimulating than just kind of going to conferences where I'm like presenting to the sort of 25 people who like roughly fall into the same area of specialization as me. Like that's just not really that interesting to me anymore.
Mm-hmm. So your work, a lot of your work and your writing focuses on various dynamics, subcommunities, cultures that appear on the internet. And one of the things that I think is interesting about that is that I think a lot of the material and the popularization of ideas that were once sort of out of bounds or rather obscure or marginalized in various ways is a result of their proliferation on the internet. How do you see the internet tied into sort of this, what I view as like this new age of blossoming intellectualism and sort of ideas? It's almost like they escaped the academy, right? Like they weren't supposed to get out, and now they're out kind of spreading around. And I view that, in terms of the proliferation of different political ideologies, the fact that no one can seem to have a common ground to talk about, values or even political identification anymore, because of the fact that there's just so many groups and subgroups and different, factions that arise. I view all of that as a sort of revealed preferences type situation. That's a result of the expansion of knowledge created by the internet. How do you think about the internet in terms of the role in your project?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's, it was a huge thing for me to discover, just that I could go directly to the general public online and just discover a critical mass of people who were interested in the kind of stuff I was interested in. So definitely that played a pivotal role in shifting my emphasis in terms of what I write and who I write for. So yeah, it's a huge factor. I think the disadvantages of it are that, I mean, a couple that relate to things that, so I've started an interview podcast as well. That's a spinoff of my blog that's recently launched. So people can check that out. It's, you find it on the same website as the blog, but I've interviewed a couple people who kind of had some interesting insights related to this. Those episodes are not yet released, but so one of them was about fashion. Was talking to somebody who thinks about how fashion is shaped by this kind of subcultural, like, niche sorting that takes place on social media platforms. So you have all the different core, you have cottagecore and you have whatever core. And how there is a kind of, so it seems like one of the effects of these platforms is it creates those kind of sorting effects. And you see that in style and fashion, right? Where people are constantly trying to differentiate themselves. And so you end up with this, this kind of sort of exponential proliferation of different niches. And so the bad thing about that is that it creates all of these niches of people who are kind of defined by, like, hating other people. And
Yeah,
it creates
I feel like
a lot of it creates a lot of obstacles, at least, whatever, in the context of this kind of fashion, people just, like, inventing these new styles and things like that. Maybe, I think my interlocutor for that thought there was something quite negative about that. I think it's even worse in the realm of ideas, because it means that just these ways that people, try to, in the attention economy, kind of project some sort of distinct identity, just become this basis of a lot of sort of trivial conflict and feuds and fighting. So I think that's an aspect of it that is maybe the negative side of it. Another aspect, which is kind of both good and bad, is that, another person I interviewed, is one of the, like, theorygram people who produces these theory memes. So there is this kind of, quite sort of overtly superficial engagement with theory, which I'm interested in as a phenomenon, but it does, it does maybe make sometimes the possibility of dialogue a bit shallow, in terms of what's possible, despite the sort of seeming traction that a lot of these ideas have. The way in which they're consumed is this hyper accelerated and hyper simplified kind of meme form.
Okay.
So I don't know. So, those are two things that are maybe, like, the darker side of it.
In terms of this relationship between ideas and theory, and that is, continental theory or French theory, whatever you want to call it, and this idea of conspiracy, it sounds like, from both the comments you made so far today, as well as other, espousings I've heard from you online, that, when you're talking about this sort of surface level reproduction of theory, or flirtation with theory, or oftentimes it's presented as a kind of, like, exposition of it. Do you think that there's sort of conspiratorial thinking with regard to the proliferation of these academic ideas, or were you talking more about conspiratorial thinking internal to the logic of those theories, or both?
I mean, I would say, this this term hermeneutic of suspicion is the one I would use here. Part of what I would say is that there's a kind of, and I'm writing something that's related to this. So to be very schematic, this term hermeneutic of suspicion comes from Paul Ricoeur. Paul Ricoeur's Freud and Philosophy. And, it describes this kind of sensibility that is associated with Marx, Freud, and, to some extent, Darwin would probably fall under that category too. And the idea of it is that, to oversimplify a lot, that there's a surface level of reality that has to be treated with distrust. And then, what the task of analysis is to kind of reach beneath that and find some kind of deep mover or some structure that accounts for the working of the surface level of reality. So anyway, the hermeneutic of suspicion is kind of the sort of the point from which all of the French theory departs to some extent or another, right? Although you could argue that in some forms it actually became a sort of critique of that surface and depth structure. But in any case, to some extent or another, it's all coming out of Freud and Marx, right? And so what you have is that sort of way that intellectual life is infused with that particular sensibility. And then kind of simultaneously with that, you have the rise of sort of popular conspiracy culture, which I would say is kind of and I would trace both of these ultimately to a sort of mediatic, like the sort of intuitiveness and popularity of this mode of thinking. I understand in terms of the kind of mediatic regime of the 20th century. I'm sort of influenced by Friedrich Kittler in his work on this, but basically, so you have the highbrow version, let's say, and then you have the sort of lowbrow version, right? The highbrow version is theory, the lowbrow version is conspiracy theory. And then I think sort of what you have is on the highbrow end, you have a kind of falling into disrepute of the sort of hermeneutic of suspicion. So you have a lot of this idea of post-critique starting around the beginning of the 20th century. And that seems to be informed by a recognition that the hermeneutic of suspicion is now the dominant frame of the entire culture, right? It's no longer this thing that distinguishes you as an intellectual who sees through what the sort of, dupes and rubes of the general populace can't see, right? In fact, it's the dupes and rubes who are themselves the most suspicious, right? So you have a sort of watershed essay by Bruno Latour called "Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam?" And this is really the parting point of it, right? What he says is essentially that the problem, he and all of his sort of French theory contemporaries were trained to believe that what you needed to do was to critique the sort of naive surface level understanding of reality that the sort of average citizen had imbibed from the sort of mediatic brainwashing machine, right? And get past that. But his position writing in about 2004 is that, in fact, the suspicious idea that all of that is this rank propaganda that needs to be that we need to look past is actually now the sort of standard view of the average person, right? And so he describes living in a village in France, and his sort of neighbor who like never didn't go to college is like making fun of him for being so naive as to believe that the 9/11 attacks really happened as the government says, right? And so I think there's a kind of so there's this the hermeneutic of suspicion becomes so popularized and so set into all dimensions of popular culture, meme space, etc., left and right, doesn't matter, that in fact there's a kind of withdrawal of the intellectuals from that and an attempt to and to me the most the clearest example of this now is COVID, right? So what do we have? Well, we have basically these random anons doing this kind of folk Foucauldian critique of biopolitics, right? And then we have these sort of blue check academics being like, believe in science, etc. So it's a remarkable transformation, and I think the COVID moment has been a real revelatory one for this process. So that's pretty much how I see it. Probably oversimplifying a little bit, but
yeah. So
those are the
I
basic
agree.
contours.
I definitely agree with you there that COVID blew the doors wide open on I would say our like cascading epistemological crises that we're in at the moment, and how they're playing out, and the fact that yeah, like there's this weird thing going on between individuals and institutions, and the institutions, I think, for a long time had thought, largely because of the structure, like the broadcast structure of the 20th century, that they would just be in charge forever and that there's no way out. Now it's looking like right now to me, and this is all my opinion, that the internet may be an escape route, maybe a way to fundamentally transform these the organization of society and the proliferation of information in a way that gives more power back to everyday people. That being and away from these institutions. Now, obviously, new institutions are going to arise who are going to replace the incumbents. And so ultimately, there will be a reconsolidation. But I am hoping that some of these technologies, cryptocurrency, for example, smart contracts, et cetera, will provide a gateway to at least lock in some of that a new freedom and a new kind of, status and prestige. I mean, I don't know how you feel about these anons who are, talking about biopower on on the internet or whatever. But in my opinion, like I almost have, and it's hard to tell. You have to be very discerning with this, but I almost have more respect for some of the anons that I follow, and view them as, I don't know about more authoritative, but more credible on certain things than I would some of the mainstream sources, just because I know for a fact that those mainstream sources have lied to me so many times. And so there's this like slow, I mean, they're just like burning up their credibility, I would say. And especially during the COVID crisis, there's been, numerous examples from all kinds of organizations. We don't need to name them here. But there is this weird thing happening. And the question for me is, and I think a lot of other people are asking this as well, people who are focusing on like, what they're calling the sense-making crisis. This show is sort of related to that. It are all saying like, okay, well, we're in this new landscape and there's a loss of credibility in the known institutional actors. And there's these new non-institutional actors who are coming up who seem to be more credible, or at least seem to have some good ideas. But the problem is, of course, you can't trust them. There's no way for you to discern whether or not they're actually trustworthy or whether they know exactly what they're talking about. Of course, and the other problem with being on the internet and just reading anything is that ultimately, to discern these things for yourself, you have to sort of become an expert on everything, or, an impossible task. And so for me, it's been really interesting to just see how this has continued to transform. And I'm very curious about how it's going to play out. But I wanted to get into this aspect of conspiracies, because conspiracy is actually something that I've purposely stayed away from on the show, in terms of like not talking about, not having people who like to talk about conspiracies on. I mean, I haven't really like selected them out or anything. It's just that I haven't taken the time to use this platform as an opportunity to talk about conspiracies. And so I'm actually very interested in your take on the proliferation of conspiracies. It sounded to me like this, the ubiquitousness of the hermeneutics of suspicion that you're talking about is something like the discovery of the unconscious, right? Or the discovery that of irrationality. And, you see this sort of in like the post-rationalist communities. People like Robin Hanson talk a lot about, how humans aren't really that rational and so forth. And so I feel like the move from modernism into postmodernism is sort of a confrontation with this fact of life that, we're not quite as rational as we thought we were. And in fact, a lot of the ways in which we act are unclear or even unknown to us. And we only sort of discover them after the fact, or you could even argue we don't even discover them eventually. We sort of just rationalize after the fact. But either way, it's this sort of feeling like we really lost our grounding in being able to make sense of the world, and even to perceive it at its most basic level, to perceive reality as it is. Now, I would argue that I think there are a lot of like physicists and mathematicians who would say, well, of course we don't really see reality for what it actually is. We have these evolved structures that are designed to see reality, to point us towards certain qualities of the environment, we have a certain orientation, and because we came out of a particular niche, we're sort of, our perceptual structures themselves are adapted to this particular niche. But how do you think about like the proliferation of conspiracy? I saw a video with Jordan Greenhall a few days ago where he was talking about this exact subject, conspiracy, and he pointed out very rightly that, well, a surprise birthday party is a conspiracy, right? Like something as innocuous as that is actually a conspiracy. You're getting together as a group of people and you're planning something out in secret, and other people or maybe no one else knows about it until it actually comes to fruition. And so one of the things that I find really interesting is that there's this whole war on conspiracy theories right now. The United States, since the Capitol attacks, has now declared a war on domestic terrorism, which is part of like the war on misinformation or the war on conspiracy theories. And I'm expecting this kind of environment to increasingly intensify over the next decade. I don't really know how it's all going to play out, and I'm not going to speculate. But how do you think about conspiracy? Do you think of it as like a serious threat? Are there particular conspiracies that you think are overly problematic? And how do you think about the institutional response by the powers that be to this sort of ubiquitous conspiracy thinking?
So a couple of things I'm influenced by in my thinking on this. One would be Jesse Walker's United States of Paranoia, which is a really excellent book. The best one, I would say, about the sort of history of conspiracy theory in the United States. And one of the points he makes is that if you look just honestly at what we might call conspiratorial thinking, which would, be, imagining a surprise birthday party, but, on some kind of grand scale, the way that it has largely been represented and framed is that this is largely a kind of folk activity that takes place among, and I would say even my account of it a little while ago sort of bought into this framing that takes place among the sort of uneducated people who don't have access to the right sort of theory. And Jesse Walker basically shows systematically throughout U.S. history that there is always a sort of equal and opposite realm of conspiratorial thinking that is precisely as conspiratorial as, for example, what the U.S. government is now identifying as so dangerous, that takes place among the governing elites, right? That the governing elites themselves are always as paranoid as the people they're trying to regulate, control, and ensure that they don't get too unruly. And so he goes back really to colonial America, right, and shows that there's you can go all the way back to, say, witch hunts and things like that, but which were orchestrated by elites, right? They were orchestrated by the governing elites of the colonies. So, but he shows this throughout history, right? And then an interesting twist is that concern about conspiracy theory, if you look at it, how it emerges mid-century, with liberals being worried about the John Birch Society and things like that, basically is itself often conspiratorial, right? That if you look at how the people, like the most famous kind of text from this period is Hofstadter's Paranoid Style in American Politics. So the interesting thing about it is that it talks about these sort of dangerous right-wing groups the same way that the dangerous right-wing groups are talking about communists, right? So there's this strange process by which not only is elite paranoia and sort of conspiratorial thinking just as dominant and often more powerful of a force, it's also often precisely in response to what is being identified as conspiracy theory that such thinking emerges. So, what I always say about this, and I it's kind of been my refrain in recent years, is, the real agents of misinformation today are the mainstream media, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
right.
The most influential things that we could identify as clearly untrue narratives that had a huge influence were coming from the top, right? They were not disseminating from the bottom. So as long as we don't recognize that, as long as we refuse to acknowledge that aspect of it, that we're not going to have a clear sense of what's going on, right? And I do think that the reasons for that are parallel, and they all have to do with the way that the information economy has evolved, and essentially the way that a sort of surfeit of information and proliferation of different narratives has increased the demand for what we might call strong signals, right? And so the one of the things that sort of conspiratorial narratives do is they offer a strong signal, right? That in some way manages to stand out, and that in some way, takes advantage of or simply, broadcasts directly to certain narrative expectations that we have, that have to do with a desire to find some kind of locus of agency, right, as an explanatory, as a means of explanation. Mm-hmm. And so I would say the proliferation of sort of top-down misinformation and the proliferation of sort of bottom-up misinformation they're the same phenomenon, right? They're both responses to
this wacky feedback loop too.
Yeah,
where they're
exactly.
sort of feeding off each other.
Exactly. Yeah, and so those aren't separable, right? They're the same. They're the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I would also, the other thing that influences me here is thinking about actual literal paranoid schizophrenia.
Okay, sure. Let's get into that.
And the way that it, so one way that you can think about it, paranoia, and Freud already, in his, in some ways questionable sort of theory of paranoia, he does have some great insights. One of which is that paranoia is as he argues is actually the attempt to sort of repair the world rather than, the paranoia is a kind of improvised cure. So the schizophrenic evolves a paranoid narrative in order to explain what has already happened to him. And what has happened to him is a total fragmentation of the world into this kind of, nonsensical and traumatic kind of wellspring of just constant noise and overstimulation, where even just the most trivial, things, just objects, experiences are sort of impregnated with some kind of apparent meaning, but they don't know what it, but he doesn't know what it is. And so the part of the trauma of the sort of schizophrenic phenomenology is that you're inundated in this world of where almost everything is signal, right? That where you can't relegate noise to the background. It's all the noise has become signal, but it's a sort of enigmatic signal. And so the idea there is that the paranoid worldview that evolves is an attempt to kind of repair that utterly shattered universe, right, where meaning has kind of been lost precisely by, because there's a kind of surfeit of meaning in a sense. Mm-hmm. And so, so the idea is basically that paranoia is a kind of ad hoc attempt at reconstructing a sort of organizing narrative for a world that has been a sort of symbolic world that has been shattered, right, and left in ruins. So, I think that, roughly speaking, you can kind of apply that mediatically to what happens when you just have a again, this situation of sort of information surfeit or information overload, right? That it has that schizophrenizing effect on everyone who partakes of it, right? And so it creates the conditions by which this kind of demand for these ad hoc narratives that in some way try to reconstruct something that would make sense, and that would sort of organize the world in hierarchical terms and kind of assign agency in certain places and relegate other things to the background. I mean, that's sort of how I would think about it roughly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like an oversimplification of that would be like, people say that like conspiracy theorists basically are trying to make sense of a really complicated world or even a complex world. And because they don't have the means or the information at their disposal to do so, they're left with sort of kind of grasping at straws, right? And as you said, constructing that meaning where there may not be any. One of the things that I was thinking about while you were explaining the schizophrenic nature of this media ecology to me was that I had a schizophrenic great uncle. And I don't know if you know this, but if you're an immigrant to a country, you're actually like at a way higher risk of actually developing schizophrenia than if you're not. And of course, he came to the United States from the Soviet Union, although I think he was already kind of down that path before he left. But regardless, one of the characteristics of his particular suffering was that he would view events on the television as relating directly to him. So if he was watching a speech by President George Bush or something like that on the TV, he thought, oh, no, like George Bush is coming after me. Like when he was talking about, going after terrorists or whatever. And I always thought that it was so interesting. There's like this extreme self-centeredness as well that ties into it, where it's not just that all these things are really meaningful. I know people personally who got pretty wrapped up in the last 5 years over the Trump situation and developed what you could arguably call a kind of Trump derangement syndrome, where they're just like, he's just like living rent free in their head all the time. And they're just like bringing him up like for no reason during everyday conversation. And it's, and you're like, okay, well, why is this like consumption of news become so meaningful to you? Like, and they're not making the long connection of like, oh, this is going to have an actual impact in my life. Like this is about me. This affects me as my schizophrenic uncle did. But in a way, they're kind of acting like they are, right? They're acting as if they did believe that, even though they're ostensibly not. And so I think that's an interesting manifestation of what you talked about, the way in which this whole environment kind of makes us somewhat schizophrenic.
Absolutely, yeah. No, there's are you familiar with this? There was a New Yorker article about it probably 5 or 6 years ago. The Truman Show delusion.
Oh, I haven't read it, but I've seen it.
Yeah. There's a known at this point, variant of a kind of classic, paranoid schizophrenic narrative, which involves, this idea that you come to believe that all of your whole life is this, you're being filmed at all times and your life is a reality show, right? And so the psychiatrist who first identified and actually wrote a quite good book about it called Suspicious Minds, was pretty much he was working at like Bellevue, I think. And he started to notice a pattern of all these people who would turn up there, who had come from other parts of the country to New York and believe that they were like either trying to find the producer of the show that they believed they were the star of, or they were, they thought that some culminating scene was going to happen at some iconic New York location where they had to be present. And, so that's what he started noticing. And I mean, so it's obviously such a that story went a bit viral just because I think it's so it's something we can all sort of recognize to some extent, right? Not to the same extreme degree, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, so that sort of delusion of reference, right? The exact thing you described as your great uncle's symptom, that's historically one of the main things that distinguishes the sort of pathological paranoid from the sort of non-pathological one, right? In other words, if I think there are Babylonian lizards running the world or whatever, I'm going to be stigmatized and it's going to be thought I'm a weirdo, but I'm not going to get institutionalized, right? But if I think the Babylonian lizards are like literally trying to kill me, then that's when I get institutionalized, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as I think you're suggesting, there's a way that, the kind of personalization of, and, an example I've brought up a lot of times is like, well, targeted ads are kind of an interesting case here because, obviously
it's a conspiracy to get you to buy stuff.
Exactly. Right. So in the old media system, right, your great uncle's typical TV-based delusion of reference was obviously ridiculous, right? And you see this idea represented in movies, right, where like it's often shown as like a sign of madness that someone will be sitting there and suddenly someone on the TV will start talking, like sort of interpolating them directly. So like, okay, obviously everyone agreed, okay, that's a clear sign of madness. But now that everything is algorithmically personalized, it's not at all as clear cut, right? So somebody claiming these sort of things cannot be dismissed in quite the same way as was the case in the past. And that's a way that sort of hyperstitionally, schizophrenia was ahead of the curve, right? It in some way instantiated these things that gradually, or it anticipated these things that gradually sort of instantiated themselves in real technologies, right? And in real social predicaments. So.
Well, one of the other dynamics there that's changed with, kind of the rise of the internet, which for whatever reason has become kind of the centerpiece of this conversation, is the interactivity component, right?
Yeah.
So when you were before, as I was talking about previously, watching a television, that was a broadcast model. So there's no real feedback between the viewer or the user in this case and the network that they're really interacting with.
Yeah.
You can write them letters or call in or whatever, but that's about it. Whereas now with the internet, there's this two-way loop. And of course, in some cases, you even have individuals just because of their prominence or their ability to attract attention or whatever it may be, who have a significant effect whenever they go on the internet on events in the real world. So there's this, some people feel like, oh, these social media platforms are so powerful, there's so much in control, but ultimately they're only as good as the users, right? And the critical mass of users that they can attract and maintain and have using their site. But one of the interesting dynamics here that I think about a lot is this concept of hyperreality. I know that you've written a lot on Baudrillard. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And this idea that overall, like, we're getting to a space where this distinction, and it's become especially acute since the lockdowns, as we're all spending more and more time online, this distinction between the virtual and the real is appearing to disintegrate. And of course, anyone who is active on Twitter knows, for example, that there is this weird feedback loop between what I do on the internet and what happens in the real world. And after a while, it does become, especially I'd say if you're a content creator, you've got your newly launched podcast as well. There is this merging over time, whereas most people view a clear distinction between sort of their online life, their social media profiles and their online personas. And okay, here's what I'm doing in the physical world, and that's sort of a very separate thing. Whereas I think, in particular, anyone that's trying to have an effect on the internet, anyone that's doing content production, I mean, this whole conversation that we're having right now is, I guess technically it's a conversation in meat space, but it's also a conversation over the internet, and it's going to go on the internet. And the reason it happened in the first place is because you and I know each other through the internet. And so there is this strange merging of the real and the virtual that's intensifying, it seems. Do you want to talk about hyperreality and how you view that tying into these ideas?
Sure. So yeah, I think, well, there's so many different angles here. So here's one dimension of it that ties back to a couple of things we've talked about. So are you familiar with this guy Cody Wilson?
No.
He's mainly known as a pioneer of 3D printed guns.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So he was, he had a sort of media splash moment in relation to that and became very controversial. In any case, he had a very weird essay, early on in the pandemic that was all Baudrillard. I mean, he's very influenced by Baudrillard, so that's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down, but I'll try to make it simple. So, what seemed insane. So Baudrillard is best known for this idea the Gulf War has not taken place, right? Which obviously was heavily ridiculed and so on, but I could explain why I think it pretty much made sense. But instead, I'll explain this sort of later variant of it. So Cody Wilson basically argued that what we were seeing with COVID was the sort of apotheosis of this hyper-real simulated reality, right? That Baudrillard had sort of heralded. So this seemed insane, right? Because I mean, come on, this is a real illness that people are literally dying of, and blah blah blah. So this sounds like the Gulf War did not take place, but sort of on steroids, right? But I mean, this argument has been utterly vindicated, I would argue, by the fact that the way that we relate to and experience the virus is entirely through the realm of simulation, right? And that, I would say that is even true if you get it.
How so?
Because first of all, just the experience of getting it is now mediated through your sort of this overlay of political discourse, right? Mm-hmm. So experiencing having COVID is itself sort of already politicized. I mean, that's not true for everyone.
I would say polluted, and it might be close to the same thing.
Yeah, but here's an example that I think explains this. So a friend of mine who's a medical anthropologist pointed me to this yesterday or the day before. So people are designing these apps that are like calculators that are supposed to help you determine the risk level of any particular activity you might undertake, right? So this is pure logic of simulation, right? It's basically your life is this point in a kind of, I mean, and the important point to understand about hyperreality is we're not just talking about simulation in the sense of some kind of VR type experience. We're talking about it in the sense of flight simulation. We're talking about it in the sense of missile launch simulation. In other words, in the sense of plotting out points on a sort of mathematical grid, right? Mm. And of everything being plugged into this probabilistic calculating system, right? And so this is why part of the point of the important point of hyperreality is not unreal. It's not fakeness or art. It's not artificiality. For Baudrillard, that's actually the earlier phase of the kind of procession of simulacra, right? The third order simulacrum of simulation. The important point of it is not fakeness or counterfeit, right? Which comes from the earlier phase. It's indeterminacy. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you have a mathematical model which is essentially probabilistic, right? And everything is plugged into that model, right? So all of reality is gradually inserted into that model, and so it is radically indeterminate at any point, right? So this experience you experience the pandemic by and not that necessarily that many people are doing it, but I'd say it's kind of the leading edge of this logic, right? You experience the pandemic by calculating on your phone the risk factor of going to the supermarket, right?
Mhm.
And so your experience of just daily activities becomes part of this probabilistic model, right? And everything you do can be understood through that logic, right? And everything that happens can be understood through that logic. I mean, it's even interesting in relation to the ambiguity of these, you know, many people point this out, right? But I mean, it's pretty indeterminate when they say such and such number of people or such and such percentage of the population has had COVID or something like that, right? I mean, the tests themselves are, you know, they're sort of within a range of probability, right? And in fact, like how exactly you process them determines how many false positives or false negatives or whatever you're going to get, right? And so, you know, if you look at the New York Times recently, you know, miraculously the curve starts going down like right after Biden's inauguration, right?
Yeah.
So that just, you look at that and you think, I mean, if you're conspiratorial minded, you think this is just fake. You know, if you're one of those like fake lib pandemic people, right? That's obviously it's just total candy to you. But the point I would make there is that, you know, because everything is plugged into these probabilistic models, you know, there is just a fundamental indeterminacy with the kind of reality that's being offered up here, right? That at every point there is an indeterminacy, and so the nature of hyperreality is that you experience that as, in other words, you experience the model, right, as the most real. And so, you know, again, what I would say to the sort of, what I would say to the sort of Baudrillardian, or the sort of Baudrillard scoffers is, you know, the point here is not that there isn't a real virus or something like that, right? That would be a very naive and much older version of thinking about simulacra. The point is rather that the reality of the virus inheres in the model, right? That the way that we experience this reality, the way we think it, the way we understand it is entirely mediated through this this kind of modeled simulation, right? And that's it's not that is you know, taking the place of the virus or means that it doesn't exist. It's that's the fundamental substrate of reality as we experience it sort of intuitively, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how I would think about that.
So, wow, yeah. So there are so many ways I could go with this. One of the things that I wanted to pull on earlier that you talked about was this nature of conspiracy and self-reference. And its relationship to, well, what you're talking about right now, which is simulation, and in particular, people who believe in what's called the simulation theory, that is, that we're living in a simulation.
Yeah.
And there's a particular variant of simulation theory that I find, well, first of all, I would like to say, just because this is my perch and I can say it, simulation theory is very, very close to actual, just straight up theology. And I just find it funny that there's so many atheists who believe in simulation theory. But anyway, outside of that's an outside remark. There's a variant of simulation theory that actually posits this sort of idea that's also kind of popular in kind of like meme space on the internet, which is that there are like sort of real people and that there are kind of like not real people. And these not real people NPCs. Are what's called like, the NPCs. And so some of us are real characters with like real personalities and real thought, like genuine thoughts. And then some of us are sort of these, I guess, deterministic, you know, machines or something or rather. Who don't really have real thoughts. They don't have any kind of original thoughts. And like, I guess the way that you know in which you're one of the real people is that you have stumbled upon this idea. But in particular, like, there's a variant of simulation theory that says that like certain people are special. And the reason that they know they're special is because so many unusual things have happened to them in life that they must be living in some kind of simulation because, oh, how could so many spectacular things be happening? The canonical example, or I guess the exponent of this would be like Elon Musk, right? Who both believes in simulation theory, and as far as I'm aware, believes in this particular variant where part of the reason he believes it is because his life is so strange and so exceptional that there must be like sort of, clockwork figures moving the pieces on the chessboard. How do you think of simulation theory in terms of this? We don't have to talk about Elon Musk specifically, although he was on Joe Rogan yesterday, so maybe he's fodder. Anyway.
Well, I mean, I think that's a pretty good illustration of this dominance of this kind of probabilistic thinking, right? Where you assess your life in terms of a probabilistic model, and you say, what's the percentage likelihood that this would happen and this would happen and this would happen, right? If you spread out all of the different possible life courses, right? And in this case, in simulation theory, it would be, well, there are all these multiple different simulations, and in some of them, one set of events is set in motion, and some, I think the idea there is congruent with the dominance of this kind of probabilistic sort of model that again, interprets reality in terms of simulated modeling, right? And so in other words, before you even posit the existence of the simulacrum that you're living in, you're already kind of thinking of your life in those terms, right? You're already saying, okay, my life is this kind of series of events that can be understood probabilistically, and for which the odds can be calculated in some sense. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, there's so much historically, both philosophy. I mean, to me, this is both a theme of philosophy and of paranoid schizophrenia, right? Where you have Descartes in Meditations on First Philosophy. I mean, he literally, as he's going through it, he says, one of the things he imagines in his process of systematic doubt is like, I look out at the street and I imagine all these people are automata, right? They're just these kind of clockwork figures, and of course that's also a sort of theme of that period, because you had this obsession with creating clockwork automata. So you have that sort of history. So that's like the NPC, the sort of Cartesian NPC, I guess. And then, I think of Daniel Paul Schreber's term for this is fleetingly improvised men in his memoirs. So the idea is like, basically he thinks like the whole human race has been wiped out except for him. But so when he looks around, he turns over there and like there are some people over there, but his belief is that like before he turned, they weren't even there, right? They were fleetingly improvised.
Schrodinger's cat type situation.
Yeah, but well, the people were, there's this higher force that just like spontaneously put those people there who are not even, who are basically virtual, just in order to make him believe that they were there. So, so obviously this has a long history, but it's interesting to me the way that it's posited today. I mean, because again, I think the Cartesian version would match this kind of earlier model of simulation that Baudrillard identifies, which is the identified with the counterfeit, right? That basically the clockwork automata are sort of counterfeit people. Whereas I think the Muskian example that you just brought up is kind of and the general idea of the world as a sort of video game like simulation where you have these, again, sort of fleetingly improvised NPCs. I think it does fit into this kind of plotting out of the world in terms of sort of mathematical models.
Yeah. Well, certainly you and I must be real, because we're having this conversation.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so where do I go next here? So I want to talk about Girard with you. I've recently gotten quite interested in Girard, actually after reading, well, this wasn't recently, but several years ago I read Peter Thiel's 0 to 1. And that sort of got me interested in Girard because there's a lot of Girardian theory kind of baked into that book in a more or less esoteric way, I would say, because he doesn't mention Girard, but it's heavily influenced at its core. And in fact, I invited a former professor of mine who runs Contagion, which is a journal of mimetic violence. It's a Girardian journal, and hopefully he'll be coming on soon. But anyway, you mentioned witch trials earlier, and this is obviously a classic example of the scapegoating mechanism and how it manifests in the world. And I think strangely enough, you were saying that, okay, these witch trials were always conducted by the elites. There's this sort of myth that, it's like these paranoid, like, yeoman farmers or whatever who just sort of are uppity about their women and like decide to like start burning witches. But you're saying, no, it's always been sort of orchestrated from the top. And I'm finding similarities between that and our discussion of again, this new like war on domestic terrorism, or I mean, you could arguably just say it's like a war on anonymity, right? Like, and there's all kinds of conspiracy theories that shoot out about like universal identification systems and microchips in people's arms from the vaccine and so forth. But there's this scapegoating that I believe is happening right now in the United States, in particular, but also just generally with the rise of the internet against kind of dissident speech, dissident thought, and it all ties very closely into your project, or who would be like the subjects of your project, or maybe the people most interested in your project, this outsider theory. These are all outsiders. And there seems to be this coordinated effort that is very, very top down and now very obvious to corral in anybody that might be too far on the fringes or might be trying to promulgate dangerous ideas. And there's a sense that, well, a lot of these people that they're targeting, I think the particular case that I think is overblown is the QAnon people. I think that heavily targeting and wanting to prosecute and find ways to jail, anyone who's, big on QAnon or, a QAnon influencer or whatever you want to call it. I don't think it's nearly as big of a threat as the system is portraying it as. And what's curious is that they're still responding with sort of overwhelming force to these perturbations. And I think of it as a scapegoating type of phenomenon. How are you thinking of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if to me, it all ties into the role of Trump to some extent, who I wrote about back in, right after he was elected, kind of in these terms. So, what's interesting about Trump is that he sort of figured out how to occupy the position of the scapegoat, in the sense of being just this kind of, magnetically polarizing figure who could just assemble this vast array of people who might otherwise not agree with each other or whatever, in opposition to him, right? And that he managed to kind of, really totally intuitively kind of marshal that position into something quite, in a strange way, and maybe sort of accidentally politically effective, at least in the campaigning part of it, right? So I think he, again, thinking about Thiel, I mean, he has these interesting lectures that were kind of part of what went into to 0 to 1, where he kind of goes into it a bit more. But this relationship between the scapegoat and the king, right? That the scapegoat position, it's obviously normally one that leads to your being expelled or killed, right? At least in the traditional context. But there's this odd reversibility where the figure of the king, I mean, and this is quite explicit in some cultures, is sacrificial, right? But the king is a kind of sacrifice victim in waiting who manages to kind of hold on to that position. And, there are various examples of, of ethnography of cultures that practice some kind of ritual sacrifice where, a victim, like in Brazil, the some of the accounts of these like cannibal tribes, right, where the victim would be captured and then would be essentially treated like royalty, right, for a certain period, and then would be sacrificed and eaten, right? Mm-hmm. And so anyway, my point is, there's something, if you can occupy that position and sort of hold it, then there's some power to be gained by doing that, right? So I think Trump is an interesting example of someone who, and I would say that institutionally there's a kind of scapegoat dimension of just the presidency in general, structurally, which you can see in the way that, like, here's an example that pre-Trump, right? So when there was the Deepwater oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, like I remember this weird thing that people were like, Obama has to fix this. Like almost like people were talking about it like he needs to literally go and like physically plug the hole. So I think that's the way that somehow any disaster is like part of the position of the president is that any disaster is directly on you, right? So that is the scapegoat, right? The scapegoat is the one who takes responsibility for misfortune. And if you think about witchcraft, again, the famous Evans Pritchard anthropologist, his nice pithy statement of this was, witchcraft is the cause of misfortune. So the point of the witch is that the witch is the person who can be identified as the cause of some, arbitrary disaster that befalls the community and can be sort of made into the means by which the community purges the thing that caused the disaster to befall it. Anyway, okay, so Trump. Sorry, going back to QAnon because I'm going off here a little bit. So Trump kind of occupies that position in an unstable and destabilizing way, but he manages to kind of hold on to it for a certain amount of time. I think what's happening now is basically now he's, literally out of the picture, right? He's not on TV. He's not drawing all that energy towards him. Mm-hmm. And so that energy has to go somewhere. And the direction that it's currently going is towards these figures who can be kind of identified with his crimes, right? With his, and these are sort of metaphysical crimes, right? They're the crimes that are often attributed to the scapegoat or the witch, right? They're basically of having just undermined the whole basis of the community and have threatened it with dissolution, right? So they need to find people who can be put in that position and can be, again, sort of purged so as to, purge this misfortune from the community. So that I think that's how I would understand it. I mean, the Q thing, of course, itself is like pretty fascinating because it itself is kind of a, essentially what it imagines is a kind of, I mean, very similarly to some, witchcraft as well as anti-Semitic, mythologies where you have, children being kidnapped and sort of ritually sacrificed. This has a long history in sort of scapegoating, the kind of myths and folklore that justified scapegoating, right? So Q is itself, its whole mythology is sort of in a way parallel to the one that is being directed against it, right? So that goes back to the point I was drawing from Jesse Walker.
Mm-hmm. Well, so. and also after President Trump left office, there was also this, next level of conspiratorial thinking by the followers of QAnon, who thought, well, okay, since Q didn't deliver on the plan, then Q must actually be a defector, right? Q is actually like a double agent or triple agent in this case,
right?
And so whether or not Q is itself an op is a whole other question that we probably won't ever know the answer to. But it's very interesting to ponder how that dynamic just continually, you can just keep escalating it ad infinitum. Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit about more about the populists and more about the Trumpists, if you want to call them that, although I don't believe every populist is a Trumpist. There are populists on the left and populists on the right. And I think a lot of the cleavages in our political system right now are actually more accurately characterized as populist versus elitist or globalist versus localist rather than left versus right. I'm someone who's been continually pushing to just sort of like encourage people to like start moving past that language because it just sort of is stifling in terms of our thinking. But one of your essays that I recently read, just because you were tweeting about it and some people were giving you some crap for it, you wrote a piece about the, I guess you could say, mischaracterization or misunderstanding of Marcuse's idea of repressive tolerance. And you can correct me on this because I may not remember the argument quite as succinctly as you made it, because it is a very particular point that you were making. And I remember this because I read it and I thought I was going to argue with you. And then I read it again and I was like, okay, well, he does have a good point here, but the argument is actually like more nuanced than his critics are giving him credit for. But basically you were saying that Marcuse has this idea of repressive tolerance. And if you want to just briefly remind the viewers what repressive tolerance is.
Yeah. So he's, writing in 1965, and his argument is that when you have and the background of this is, he's part of the Frankfurt School, and the Frankfurt School has this understanding of the culture industry, right, which is this this huge apparatus that seemingly, free, and here we could get into kind of, whether this is ultimately conspiratorial or not, right, but that at least seemingly freely and independently is nevertheless an incredibly effective sort of propaganda machine for maintaining the status quo and supporting and basically, making people either blind to or accepting of the dominance of this elite, which is essentially identified with the sort of, this is mid-century sort of military-industrial complex, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea of repressive tolerance is that, what part of the way that the system works, unlike the sort of classic totalitarianism that a lot of people were writing about in this time of the, basically Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, is it is tolerance, right? It permits dissent. It does not prosecute people for dissent. And this was post-McCarthyism, so obviously that may have been a bit more nuanced the previous decade. But writing in the 60s, the idea was it's permitting all of this dissent to flower, and thus we must be living in a freer society than those bad totalitarian places. So Marcuse's argument is no, because basically what happens is when you have a society that, first of all, is dominated by this incredibly powerful sort of corporate culture industry, it can allow people who are in some way dissenting to speak, but can simply, to oversimplify, sort of drown them out, right? And it also falsely presents there as being a kind of parity between, the sort of establishment position and the dissenting position, right? It sort of falsely presents it that those two positions can be debated openly, and the dissenters will not be punished, and therefore they have equal rights to make their case as anyone else. So Marcuse's position is that when you have that kind of imbalance whereby the culture industry sort of dominates the airwaves with a certain set of messages that support the reigning establishment, which and I think something ambiguous here is he talks about the right? And I think he does not mean like the John Birch Society or the Barry Goldwater or something like that. I think, because he's talking about the people who are, at that time perpetrating the Vietnam War. So I think within the right, he's including, let's say, the Johnson administration, the entire sort of bipartisan, essentially pro-military industrial complex, and sort of capitalist elite, right? So his claim is that the disposition of the sort of mediatic disposition of the society so favors the right that it represses the left more effectively, even than would be the case in a sort of, I mean, he talks about this as democratic totalitarianism, right? Or totalitarian democracy. Even more so than would be the case in a purely totalitarian society, right? Because it also grants the illusion that it's possible to hold these ideas. Mm-hmm. So repressive tolerance is tolerance that actually succeeds in repressing precisely by tolerating and creating this false premise that there's an equal contestation when there isn't.
Mm-hmm.
So that's basically the argument. And then I don't know if you want me to get what his proposed sort of remedy to that is.
But, well, so we can get into the remedies real quick, but I just wanted to say, you were arguing in this particular piece, and of course you can state it more clear than I can if I'm mistaken, that the true inheritors of Marcuse's idea of repressive tolerance, or his, I guess, fix to repressive tolerance, which we'll get into, are actually the right. You know, I would say in particular the reactionary right, rather than sort of the mainstream right, whatever that means, rather than the left. Whereas often the way that it's characterized online, and you talk about these sort of, you know, meme lords, people who sort of just like repackage French theory into memes and then act like it's like new stuff that no one knew about. That they're sort of getting it wrong. They're getting it wrong by assuming that who Marcuse is talking about is still the left, and that is in fact more closely the right. So there's been this sort of strange reversal or inversion, if you will.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is that about right?
Yeah. So basically So in terms of his prescription, I mean, he describes it as utopian, right? But basically his argument is that as a consequence of this situation that I described, he argues that the left, right, should not accept this premise of tolerance, but should rather strive to suppress or be intolerant of the positions of the right, which again, and this is why it's utopian, right? Because basically what he's saying is that we should move to a situation where what are currently the dominant ideological forces of society should be suppressed, right? And tolerance should be accorded instead to what are currently the dissident factions of the society. So obviously this is utopian because and he describes it specifically as a petitio principii, right? He says, well, obviously, in order for that to occur, it would have to be already the case that the left is more capable of exerting power than it currently is, right? Because how else is it going to suppress the right? So, so he frames it explicitly as sort of a paradoxical or circular argument, but at the same time, his basic, TLDR is we shouldn't on the left accept the premise of tolerance, right? In the sort of classic liberal sense, right, of sort of tolerance of a sort of universal tolerance of free speech. So the way I sort of took that into the present is to observe that, so first of all, you have this longstanding idea that that this argument is the actual inspiration for a lot of the sort of censorious political correctness that, first became dominant on campuses and then became dominant in the media and more broadly, as cancel culture, right? So in other words, the claim there is that is applied Marcusean his own version of repressive there's the repressive tolerance that he's criticizing, which is his people being repressed. Then there's the repressive tolerance that he's supporting, which is his people repressing the bad people, like the right. Yes. So that version of the sort of positive program of repressive tolerance, which is basically using whatever means available to repress the right's ideological positions, could be seen as the sort of successor, the way that's manifested in political correctness and so on, could be seen as the direct sort of application of Marcuse's argument. Now, I guess my critique of that reading, which I think is partly right, but my critique of it is that it doesn't take into account the structural and material conditions that prevail today, which are basically that far from being repressed, a wide range of what we might have thought of as left-wing positions are actually embraced and tolerated by precisely the underlying forces that Marcuse saw as the real enemy, right? Which is essentially the military-industrial complex, right, and the sort of corporate capitalist regime. So in other words, if you have the same basic material and sort of structural dispensation, which remains unchanged, but some of the positions that were, regarded as sort of beyond the pale left positions in Marcuse's time, or even 20 years ago or 10 years ago, are now, you can be sort of Raytheon, or, you can be whatever, you can be the CIA, and sort of, tolerate or even embrace those positions. Then something very strange is happening here, right? Because the idea that, the point of Marcuse's argument was that the left needs to repress these ideologies because they're the basis of this unjust social system, right? So the left needs to suppress the ideas as part of a political economic transformation. So what if the political economic dispensation remains the same, but the ideologies shift? Well, what happens is that the people who are actually in the position of Marcuse in 1965 saying, we as ideologically marginalized people have to reject this premise of tolerance and, push towards a situation where we can actively suppress the positions that are currently marginalizing our own. That position is not that of a sort of, let's say, middle of the road leftist today, I don't think, in many regards. So on the other hand, I guess the argument I made there, it is actually a position you see increasingly adopted, as you said, kind of on the reactionary right? And the idea there is precisely that this kind of progressive liberal ideology has become so fully dominant in the institutions that they have no ability to, in any way, advocate. The playing field is so slanted against them, right, that embracing this idea of tolerance is a sort of a fool's game, right, from their perspective. And so, in a sense, they have come to occupy a position not unlike the one that Marcuse describes the left in 1965. So I think that's pretty much the argument in broad strokes.
Great. Well, thank you for recapitulating that
for
me here. I appreciate it. So, yeah, one of the problems that I had in processing your argument and trying to formulate what I thought about it, because initially, as I said, I was going to try to write some tweets to argue against it, because I thought that you were sort of mischaracterizing some things. But then I considered that you probably had sort of thought it through well enough, and that, just for the sake of the piece, it doesn't make sense to just argue against yourself in circles. But yeah, I agree here that there does seem to be a kind of mutually escalating fervor for intolerance of the other side's ideas, and I think this is on both sides. Again, tying into to mimetic theory, where it's true that in these large military-industrial complex and related corporate institutions, um, it's very obvious at this point that the ideology is more or less left, or at least nominally left. But it's not left in the way that the people in 1965 would have imagined it would be. And I think the key disconnect for Marcuse is that he viewed the shift in ideological orientation as correlating with an underlying change or transformation in kind of like the economic and the power structures that surround it. But of course, if those are a more first order attractor, then you can sort of almost interchange the ideology, right? You can sort of just like paint it. You could paint the CIA building rainbow colors, and it's still the CIA.
Yeah.
And I think I tend to be an observer, at least a lurker, in lots of different political circles. And the leftists that I know who would consider themselves true leftists are also appalled by this. But of course, many of the mainstream liberals or leftists, if you want to call them that, that I interact with, in my normal life, don't really see any of this as a problem. And in fact, they're still sort of talking as if it's still 1965 and as if there are these sort of marginalized groups that have no power. And then it's like, well, like, have you looked around at like Google or like the CIA or like the NSA or like any of these giant power institutions? They're all like down for the I don't know if you could quite say they're down for the revolution. They don't exactly want socialism or communism, but they are certainly not, at least on the surface, right-wing organizations in any meaningful sense. And so I think teasing out this like apparent contradiction is something that, jives a lot of people the wrong way. And I agree that there is like an intolerance. I mean, there is an intolerance streak that's coming out of the reactionary right where they're saying, well, look, we've tolerated these ideas for so long, and it's because we've tolerated them that they've been allowed to proliferate and they've been allowed to sort of enter into the minds and the institutions of power. And they're the reason that we're getting canceled and we can't, talk or whatever. And so therefore, what we have to do is start playing their game, right? We have to play dirty just like they do. And then there's this sort of other group on the right who are sort of more on the libertarian side, less authoritarian, who are more geared towards, I mean, often they go under the label of like classical liberals, which I would say that I identified myself as one for quite a while. And the classical liberals are making this argument that like, no, actually, like if we engage in the same, I guess, bad behavior or unfair selectivity around ideas that are sort of sensible ideological opponents are, then we're just going to we're going to be called hypocrites, and also it's not really the kind of society that we want. And so we have to sort of go back to the way that things were, or at least supposedly were before. I've become increasingly skeptical of that position and whether or not it's even realistic. More and more, I've come to the conclusion that I don't think there ever really was a kind of true classical liberalism. I view it more as like an ideal than an actual state of affairs that existed in any place. But I think there are arguments to be made that we're less tolerant than we were before. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask you is whether or not you think that this concept of free speech, which this whole idea of repressive tolerance kind of centers around, being able to sort of speak your mind, but then through that it kind of, I'm sorry, I'm moving ahead of myself. What do you think the mechanism there is by which it sort of maintains power despite allowing dissent? Because if it's true that the power structures will remain even if you allow the proliferation of dissent, then the argument that we should be intolerant actually doesn't make sense, because of course the dissent wouldn't do anything. And so what do you think is the purported mechanism of that? Do you think that, for example, allowing lots of dissent, and this is the argument that I think a lot of classical liberals would make, although they tend to veil it, I would say. Allowing the dissent is actually sort of like a release valve for internal tensions and contradictions and for the unseen and the unheard. And by allowing them to sort of have this fit, right, to throw a tantrum and to do so in their speech, in their protest behavior online, as long as they're not hurting anyone, as long as they're not destroying property, whatever the restrictions you want to put on it are, that it sort of dissipates the energy and in fact actually stops the real revolution from actually being able to take place in terms of upending existing power structures and doing a transformation on the society in a meaningful way, because of the fact that, well, you can sort of just like let off steam, right? You can go talk on your podcast or tweet about it on Twitter, like the president like President Trump before he was banned on Twitter. You can go sort of like blow off steam, and then you don't need to have your you don't need to have like your military coup or whatever people thought he was going to do. Do you view that as like I'm sorry. What do you think of that argument that there is this like mechanism of dissipation of the energies that actually prevents a real change from happening? Or do you think that like no, there is going to be some kind of transformation if you allow dissent, and so therefore I'm not going to ask you to make an authoritarian argument, but go ahead.
Yeah. So a few things. To me, it's interesting. So first of all, for a long time, I even before I discovered it, I kind of tacitly accepted this Marcuse argument that, at least the sort of descriptive side of it. And that's partly because I kind of got interested in Marxism as a teenager and was sort of on the left. And it was obvious to me, and we're talking like late 90s, early 2000s here. It was obvious to me that the left was profoundly irrelevant in American culture and politics, at least the sort of Marxist left. Mm-hmm. And it was also obvious to me that had nothing to do with persecution or the ideas being banned, right? It just had to do with the way that they could be sort of seemingly spontaneously marginalized and made irrelevant and even kind of laughable, right? So it seemed to me that, intuitively I understood this idea that you can make certain ideas inefficacious just by allowing them to be circulated, but just in various more tacit ways, kind of rendering them irrelevant. So like that argument seemed obvious to me, but there are things that I don't. I think it's also worth looking at what the positions are that do become explicitly banned, or at least that are, if you adopt them, you attract like a large consensus of people who agree that those positions should be marginalized, right? And I think when you think about what those are, you do learn things, not necessarily because they're correct, but because the fact that they can't be allowed or can't be given a platform tells you something about the sort of larger the things that are not debatable, right? The things that are not debatable. So to me, the thing that that most struck me about, the original Trump campaign, right, touched on a few of these and was partly remarkable because he said things that were impermissible in the sort of bipartisan dispensation, and again were the basis of sort of attempts to effectively cancel him, right? Hence his kind of scapegoat energy. And these were not necessarily, the ones that are usually brought up are the like, oh, the Mexicans are rapists and so on, right? That's the stuff that's usually brought up. But the stuff that isn't brought up as much, but that to me was remarkable, was like trade, right? The stuff he said about trade. Now, it is absolutely true that being anti-free trade, particularly at that point, was just a no-no across the political spectrum, right? You could not in any respectable political context adopt that position anymore, right? And that hadn't been the case decades before. But the basic political economy necessitated that the political and media elite unite around this position, right? That free trade is good and necessary, and if you oppose it on the right, then you're anti-growth and so on, and you don't believe in dynamic capitalism. If you oppose it on the left, then maybe you're like racist and you don't want people in Bangladesh to have jobs. But that was a position that was heavily stigmatized, right? And you could see how that so it not only had to be sort of rejected, but it had to be treated as sort of beyond the pale of what you could adopt if you wanted to be respectable, and you'd be kind of ridiculed and cast out of polite society if you were against free trade, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean that's a super interesting case, right? Because it doesn't it's not necessarily a left or right position. It's been adopted to some extent by both, but it was clearly a kind of third rail of American politics for a long time. And then Trump sort of violated that. So I think that's a good example of how there are certain positions you can adopt that have to be sort of repressed in more overt ways, not in the sense of being banned, but just in the sense of being so heavily stigmatized. So that's like an example of where I think it's not just that, these sort of oppositional positions that in some way actually like call into question the system in some broad sense are sort of allowed to be pronounced, but then can just be kind of subtly marginalized. Like there are some that actually have to be directly stigmatized and treated with total disdain by the entire establishment and sort of treated as beyond the pale, right? And so I think Trump's, kind of certain kind of naivete that allowed him to, but also kind of, just incredible political instinct that allowed him to kind of get away with that. Now, it didn't allow him to actually really do much about it. I mean, I think he sort of at the margins did some things related to that, but so I don't know. I've sort of been going on about that for a while, but that to me is like one of the more interesting cases of that protectionism was a position that and it's a position that, unlike fantasizing about repeating the Bolshevik Revolution or whatever you do when you're a Marxist, right? Unlike fantasizing about some kind of future dream of full communism, which I don't think anybody really cares that much. I mean, it's not dangerous because it's LARP. It's sort of intellectual LARPing. Questioning free trade does actually strike at the heart of something that's fundamental to our, to the current political, economic, and media establishment, and it's sort of necessary functioning. So,
yeah, and that's one of those issues too, where I am seeing again this kind of ideological realignment, where a lot of your classic socialist or even Marxist people on the left would be actually in favor of trade barriers and restrictions on international trade, and they would be in good company with a lot of the reactionary right, who out of places like the Rust Belt. I'm here in Michigan, who are upset about the loss of manufacturing jobs and sort of the hollowing out of Middle America, and both of those groups could find common ground on this idea of, well, maybe we shouldn't be like just selling out to international finance and these large soulless, multinational conglomerates who frankly just don't care about any country or the people, largely living in it.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so that's one of those interesting. It's interesting to me that you brought that up as one of the sort of third rails, as you said, that's untouchable. But the victims are not obvious. Like, who's the victim of trade barriers? Well, we're not going to have sort of like an abstract notion of economic efficiency maximized globally.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, like, what does that mean? Yeah, I'm not so sure. So anyway, but we're getting close to probably the end of our time here. We've been going on for quite a while, and I think we could go on for a lot longer. At any rate, I want to ask you a few more questions here before I let you go while I still have you. One of the things is about just kind of like your general research disposition. I mean, you're all over the place, and I mean that in a good way. I mean, your writing is great, and you're drawing on all kinds of sources. And even in this topic, even in this conversation, you've mentioned a bunch of books that I've tried to write down all of, and that I'm going to have to review. But what are the corners of the internet or subcultures or phenomena right now that are going on that you're most interested in the context of your outsider theory project?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, going back to something we've discussed previously, I'm just very interested in the, sort of Anon world, and particularly how it's related to the COVID crisis, and not just the Anon world, but just the fact that you have this very interesting phenomenon of just random people without any particularly significant platform clearly being much more honest and trustworthy observers of this situation than much of the media. So I mean, that's been just a really interesting phenomenon to observe, and it relates to a lot of stuff I'm interested in. Another much weirder thing that I have written about and will probably write more about was the sort of 5G related, the way the 5G conspiracy theories and COVID conspiracy theories kind of merged. And so there was this idea that 5G was the vehicle by which COVID spread, or that COVID was like a myth to cover up the effects on the body of 5G radiation.
Yep.
So I mean, I wrote some about that last year. What's interesting to me is that it makes evidence something that that's just literally true, which is that you have this co-evolution of sort of mediatic or informational virality and literal virality, and that those two things are inseparable, right? That we experience the virus again through the lens of this simulation that's sort of streamed to us at all times, and so the virus is always virtual as well as real, and I mean, in fact, it's like fundamentally virtual, right, and sort of secondarily real, I would say. And so the 5G conspiracy, which has sort of petered out, you don't hear as much about it anymore, but to me it's like a fascinating sort of myth, which is one of the ways I think about conspiracy. It's a kind of mythology that captures something very real, right? Which is that there's a deep connection between sort of informational globalization, right? Which 5G is the physical, the creation of 5G and the construction of 5G towers, often in contract with the Chinese company Huawei in Europe, at least, is a manifestation of the same process that spread COVID, right? Which is the sort of total economic integration of the globe. So I'm very interested in, again, that particular conspiracy theory as a lens into this relationship between informational virality and biological virality. So
awesome.
I think those are two things.
Cool. And last but not least, I just want to give you a real quick chance to plug your new show, because it is a new show, and part of why I wanted to have you on. So what are you doing with the Outsiders podcast, and what can people expect from it? I'm sorry, Outside Theory.
I mean, right. So the blog, is still going. I mean, I'm trying to write like a longish post per month at least, at minimum. So that's still going. But the inspiration for the podcast was just to get people who I'm interested in, whose ideas I like, to come on and talk about themes related to some of what I write about on the blog. So it's, so the two projects are closely linked in that way. And so I'm intending to get guests who speak to the range of things that I described earlier that I'm interested in for the blog. And yeah, so far the first episode was with Angela Nagel to talk about issues we've sort of addressed, the way that the sort of reactionary right has come to occupy this countercultural position, and specifically the Capitol riot as a manifestation of that, as well as Q and a few other things. So that was great, and that first episode got a pretty good amount of traction, so I was happy with that. Then the second one, just to point to another thing that will be a recurring theme, was about going back to another thing we've discussed, a famous or sort of cult figure who was a schizophrenic pamphleteer who basically like typed out and Xeroxed these pamphlets elaborating his theories, and would like just mail them out to people and put them under windshield wipers and stuff. And this was back in the 60s, 70s, and this was Francis E. Deck. So I had Gio Pinacchietti, who's a interesting person on Twitter, artist, writer, anyway, to talk about Deck. So I think you can expect more like that. It'll always be interviews. It'll often be with people like Angela of some repute, with publications to their name, and then sometimes it'll be more people from the sort of anon sphere, or just people with some internet following but who might not be known beyond that or have any publications beyond their tweets or whatever. So
awesome.
Be a mix of those.
I'm very excited to hear it and listen to your new episodes and see what kind of guests you pull in later. In particular, like I think the anons, like interviewing anons for like podcasts or even text transcript interviews is a really underutilized mode. So I'm really excited to hear more of those. Anyway, well, thank you so much, Geoff, for coming on. I really appreciate it, and have a great day. See you guys.
Yeah, thanks. It's been fun.